Welcome to our channel. Here, we dive deep into the most intriguing stories from history. Today, we're exploring the hidden connections of one of America's most notorious gangsters, Al Capone. In this video, we uncover the politicians and officials who secretly protected Capone, allowing him to build an empire of crime while avoiding the law for years. Al Capone's hidden connections, the politicians who protected him. Alphonse Gabriel, Al Capone, the infamous Chicago mob boss, is widely remembered for his ruthless control over bootlegging, gambling, and organized crime during the Prohibition era. However, many people overlook a crucial aspect of his empire: the hidden network of politicians and law enforcement officials who allowed him to operate with near impunity. Capone's power was not only a result of fear and violence but also of strategic alliances with influential figures in Chicago's political system. These connections ranged from city council members and police officials to state politicians who were willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for bribes, favors, or political loyalty. One of the most notable aspects of Capone's protection was his ability to manipulate city law enforcement. High-ranking police officers were often on his payroll, providing him with inside information about raids, investigations, and even federal probes. This allowed Capone to relocate operations, hide profits, and avoid arrests while rivals faced the full force of the law. Beyond the police, Capone's influence extended into the political machinery of Chicago. City aldermen and state legislators often received financial incentives to ignore his illegal enterprises. During election cycles, Capone and his associates reportedly mobilized votes, organized rallies, and used intimidation tactics to ensure that friendly politicians remained in office. This created a cycle where politicians owed their positions, at least in part, to Capone's influence. Capone's protection was not limited to lower-level officials. Certain high-ranking state and federal figures were rumored to have been influenced or intimidated by Capone's network. Although direct evidence is scarce, historians suggest that Capone's ability to avoid serious legal consequences for so many years was partially due to these covert political alliances. By leveraging these connections, Capone ensured that investigations into his operations were slowed or entirely derailed. Speakeasies, gambling dens, and illicit breweries flourished under his empire because the law enforcement and political systems that should have curtailed them were compromised. This complex web of protection demonstrates that Capone's success was not only the result of fear and brutality but also strategic political maneuvering. Understanding these hidden connections is essential to grasping the full scope of his criminal empire and the systemic corruption that allowed one man to dominate Chicago's underworld for nearly a decade. The hidden political network behind Al Capone, expanded version. Al Capone's dominance over Chicago's underworld during the 1920s and early 1930s was not solely built on violence, intimidation, and organized crime. It was deeply intertwined with a carefully cultivated network of political protection that allowed him to operate almost openly. To understand Capone's ability to evade the law for so long, one must examine the depth and breadth of his connections within Chicago's political and law enforcement structures. At the municipal level, Capone's influence extended into the Chicago Police Department. Numerous officers, from beat cops to high-ranking officials, were reportedly on his payroll. Bribes flowed regularly, ensuring that raids on speakeasies, gambling dens, and illegal breweries were delayed or entirely canceled. Some police officers provided Capone with detailed intelligence on ongoing investigations, tip-offs about incoming federal agents, or warnings about shifts in law enforcement strategy. This allowed Capone to move operations quickly, relocate stockpiles of alcohol, and avoid capture with remarkable efficiency. The city council was another pillar of Capone's network. Many aldermen benefited financially or politically from his support. During election periods, Capone's organization mobilized thousands of votes, often using both persuasion and intimidation, to ensure that favorable politicians secured office. These alliances were mutually beneficial. Politicians received financial support and votes, while Capone gained an added layer of protection from legal scrutiny. Publicly, these officials appeared independent, but privately, many were complicit in sustaining his criminal empire. State-level politicians were also not immune to Capone's influence. Reports and historical records suggest that Capone's financial reach sometimes extended into the state legislature, where he could manipulate legislation or slow law enforcement efforts. Laws that might have interfered with his operations often faced delays, weakening enforcement, or outright inaction. While not all state politicians were directly involved, the pervasive culture of corruption meant that Capone's influence could ripple through the political system with ease. Capone's network of protection even reached the federal level, though less overtly. Certain federal officials and investigators struggled to gather evidence against him because local law enforcement, under his sway, failed to cooperate fully. Capone's legal teams and intermediaries often employed both bribes and social connections to ensure federal scrutiny was minimized. This interplay between municipal, state, and federal authorities highlights how Capone leveraged systemic weaknesses in government and law enforcement to his advantage. Moreover, Capone's relationship with politicians was not only transactional but also strategic. He understood the importance of cultivating a public image of influence and inevitability. By hosting high-profile events, donating to charitable causes, and maintaining a visible presence in Chicago's social circles, he positioned himself as someone untouchable, not just in the criminal sense but also politically. Politicians who aligned with him gained access to resources, influence, and protection, further solidifying the gangster's position. Capone's protection network also had practical benefits for his criminal operations. His speakeasies, underground gambling halls, and illicit breweries thrived because they were shielded from raids and closures. Bookkeepers and managers within his organization could operate confidently, knowing that political interference would prevent major disruptions. Even rival gangs had to navigate this web of protection, often facing heightened risk when attempting to challenge Capone's operations. Ultimately, the story of Al Capone's hidden political connections is a testament to the interplay between organized crime and systemic corruption. His ability to evade law enforcement for years was not solely the result of fear and intimidation but also careful manipulation of the political and legal landscape. By understanding the depth of these relationships, one can see how a single gangster was able to build a vast empire under the very noses of those meant to stop him. This intricate web of alliances highlights a broader historical reality. Organized crime often thrives in environments where politics, law enforcement, and corruption intersect. Capone's case remains one of the clearest examples of how political protection can amplify criminal power, demonstrating that his influence was as much about strategic relationships as it was about brutality. The full scope of Al Capone's political protection, expanded insight. Al Capone's empire in Chicago during the 1920s was not only built on violence, bootlegging, and gambling but was sustained by an intricate network of political allies who shielded him from law enforcement and federal intervention. Understanding how Capone maintained power requires examining the depth, complexity, and reach of his connections, which span municipal, state, and federal levels, as well as the strategies he employed to manipulate and protect his interests. Municipal protection. Chicago Police Department and local officials. From the outset, Capone's influence in the Chicago Police Department was a key factor in his ability to operate with near impunity. Numerous beat officers, detectives, and higher-ranking officials were allegedly on his payroll. These officers would often ignore illegal activities taking place in speakeasies, gambling dens, and underground breweries. In some cases, they actively supplied Capone's organization with intelligence, such as information about upcoming raids, investigations, or federal inquiries. This allowed his operations to relocate, reorganize, or cover tracks before any enforcement could occur. Aldermen and city council members were also part of this network. Capone strategically supported candidates during elections, using both persuasion and intimidation to secure votes in favor of politicians who would protect his interests. In return, these officials maintained a blind eye toward his illegal enterprises. By manipulating voter turnout and political influence, Capone effectively created a political shield around his operations. Many public officials, appearing independent in the media, were in fact complicit in sustaining his criminal empire. State-level influence and legislative manipulation. Capone's reach extended beyond the city into Illinois' state government. Through financial incentives and social influence, he could affect certain legislative actions or delay laws that might disrupt his operations. State authorities, sometimes aware of his activities, were reluctant to act due to either direct bribes or fear of retaliation from Capone's organization. The systemic corruption at this level demonstrates how Capone's empire thrived not only because of fear on the streets but also because of calculated influence within political structures. Federal-level challenges. Even at the federal level, law enforcement faced challenges in prosecuting Capone. Federal agents, including those from the IRS and the early FBI, often relied on cooperation from local law enforcement. However, due to Capone's deep municipal connections, this cooperation was limited or deliberately obstructed. Intelligence gathered by federal agents frequently reached Capone's network before it could be acted upon. This lack of coordination allowed him to continue his operations without immediate threat of arrest. Case studies of political protection. One striking example of Capone's political influence involved his relationship with city treasurers and judges. These officials were reportedly offered direct payments to influence court outcomes, reduce fines, or dismiss cases altogether. In high-profile incidents, such as raids on illegal breweries or violent gang confrontations, sympathetic judges ensured that charges either never reached trial or were quickly dismissed. This allowed Capone to project an image of untouchability, reinforcing his control over rivals and the public perception that he was beyond the reach of the law. Public image and charitable engagements. Capone's political strategy was complemented by his public relations efforts. By participating in charity drives, sponsoring events, and publicly supporting community initiatives, he positioned himself as a benefactor of the people. This dual image, a ruthless gangster in private and a generous, civic-minded figure in public, made it politically risky for local authorities to challenge him. Opponents feared backlash not only from his organization but also from public perception, effectively deterring intervention. Interactions with rival gangs. Capone's network also served as a strategic tool in dealing with rival gangs. By ensuring that his political connections protected his operations, he forced rival groups to operate under increased risk. Any attempt to encroach on his territory or challenge his operations could result in legal scrutiny, raids, or manipulated law enforcement responses orchestrated through his political allies. The Hawthorne Smoke Shop Massacre, for instance, highlighted not only his brutality but also his calculated use of political cover to eliminate competition without immediate legal consequences. Bribery and the economics of protection. The financial dimension of Capone's protection network cannot be overstated. Bribes were meticulously calculated, ensuring loyalty without drawing overt attention. Payments to police officers, judges, and politicians were structured to avoid direct evidence, often delivered through intermediaries or disguised as campaign donations. These financial arrangements ensured consistent cooperation and built a network of individuals whose personal or political gain was directly tied to Capone's continued success. Impact on law enforcement and policy. Capone's political network had long-term effects on law enforcement strategies in Chicago. Federal agents recognized that arresting or prosecuting a figure like Capone required more than evidence, it demanded breaking through systemic corruption. This realization eventually led to the focus on financial crimes, specifically tax evasion, as a way to bypass politically compromised local authorities. The successful conviction of Capone in 1931 for tax evasion was as much a triumph over political shielding as it was over criminal activity. Conclusion. The power of political alliances. Al Capone's story illustrates how deeply organized crime can intertwine with politics. His ability to evade justice for years was not merely due to intimidation or street power but also his sophisticated manipulation of political and legal structures. By carefully selecting allies at every level of governance, maintaining a strategic public image, and leveraging financial incentives, Capone created an empire protected not only by fear but by institutional complicity. This comprehensive political shielding made him one of the most notorious, yet untouchable, gangsters in American history. Capone's influence on lawmakers and the judiciary. A detailed examination. Al Capone's control over Chicago was not limited to street-level enforcement and his gang network, it extended deeply into the halls of power, influencing lawmakers, judges, and other officials who had the authority to either challenge or protect his criminal empire. His strategic manipulation of the legal and political systems demonstrates an understanding of power that went far beyond simple intimidation. Political manipulation and election influence. Capone's network began at the municipal level, where he used both money and influence to sway elections. Candidates who were sympathetic to his operations, or who could be easily manipulated through bribes, were supported with campaign funds and voter mobilization efforts. Capone's influence over political machines ensured that elected officials owed him their positions and would, in return, protect his illegal ventures. These alliances meant that city ordinances, police enforcement, and local judicial decisions could be bent in his favor without raising public suspicion. Judicial corruption and courtroom influence. Capone's interactions with the judiciary were a critical element of his protection. He understood that trials and legal proceedings could potentially dismantle his empire if judges were impartial. By targeting specific judges and offering financial incentives, he ensured favorable rulings or the dismissal of charges in cases against him or his associates. Some judges were allegedly paid to slow legal processes, reduce sentences, or outright dismiss evidence. This legal manipulation allowed Capone to maintain the illusion of invincibility and deter rivals from challenging his authority. Federal oversight and local resistance. Even when federal authorities, including the FBI and IRS, attempted to investigate Capone, his entrenched local influence created significant obstacles. Local officials, whether through loyalty, bribery, or fear, often obstructed federal efforts. Tips about upcoming raids, delays in processing warrants, and manipulation of court records were all part of the broader strategy that kept Capone one step ahead. The interplay between local corruption and federal law enforcement highlighted the challenges of prosecuting a criminal who had carefully embedded himself within political structures. Backroom deals and secret meetings. Capone was known for holding private meetings with influential politicians and civic leaders. These backroom negotiations ensured mutual benefit. Capone could continue his operations while politicians and officials received financial rewards, favors, or protection from criminal elements in their constituencies. Such arrangements were meticulously documented within his organization, allowing for a system of accountability and reinforcement among those who were part of his protective network. Impact on law enforcement morale and public perception. The influence Capone exerted on politicians and judges had a significant psychological effect on law enforcement officers and the general public. Police officers, knowing that their superiors were compromised or that legal actions could be nullified by political allies, were often demoralized or hesitant to act against Capone. Public perception also played a role. Citizens witnessing the lack of consequences for violent or illegal activities concluded that Capone was untouchable. This perception reinforced his power and made any opposition, whether from rival gangs or law enforcement, appear futile. Integration with business and civic interests. Capone's political network was not isolated to direct bribes and intimidation, it was integrated with legitimate business and civic interests. Support from business owners, Chamber of Commerce members, and charitable organizations provided an additional layer of public approval. By fostering relationships with influential community leaders, Capone created a multi-tiered network of protection that combined fear, loyalty, and respectability. This blend of intimidation and public image management ensured that his influence reached far beyond the criminal underworld, affecting policy, public safety, and economic activity in Chicago. The long-term consequences of political corruption. The entanglement of Al Capone with political and judicial figures in Chicago had lasting consequences for governance and law enforcement. The failure to effectively prosecute him for years demonstrated the vulnerabilities of a system infiltrated by corruption. It also underscored the necessity for federal agencies to develop new strategies, such as focusing on financial crimes, in order to bypass compromised local institutions. Capone's network became a case study in how organized crime could exploit political systems to maintain power. Conclusion. The structural genius behind criminal power. Al Capone's strategic approach to politics and law enforcement showcases a level of structural genius rarely seen in criminal history. His empire thrived not just on violence or fear, but on an intricate web of political and judicial protection that allowed him to operate openly for years. By leveraging elections, influencing legislation, manipulating court outcomes, and creating public goodwill, Capone turned Chicago's institutions into extensions of his criminal enterprise. The lessons of this period demonstrate the profound effect that political alliances, systemic corruption, and strategic influence can have on both criminal enterprises and the societies they inhabit. The ultimate downfall. How Capone's web of influence collapsed. Despite Al Capone's intricate network of political allies, corrupt judges, and compromised law enforcement, the cracks in his empire eventually began to show. His overconfidence in the invincibility of his political and judicial protection ultimately led to his downfall. While local officials were manipulated or bribed, the federal government was not as easily swayed. Agencies like the IRS, Prohibition Bureau, and FBI began to coordinate efforts in ways that bypassed Capone's local influence, targeting the vulnerabilities he had overlooked. Financial oversight is a weakness. Capone's reliance on cash transactions, hidden assets, and complex accounting within his criminal enterprises initially helped him evade the law. However, this same financial secrecy became his Achilles heel. Federal investigators focused on income tax violations and money trails, which were meticulously documented, often by Capone's own organization, to track payments and operations. By using forensic accounting, investigators were able to build a case that could not be obstructed by local political interference, highlighting the power of financial oversight against even the most protected criminals. Key federal strategies and investigations. The federal approach was multi-layered. While Capone had created an illusion of untouchability in Chicago, federal authorities used surveillance, undercover operations, and informants to gather evidence outside the reach of his local network. They focused on indirect avenues, such as monitoring business fronts, luxury purchases, and unusual wealth accumulation, which provided irrefutable proof of income that had not been taxed. These methods demonstrated that even extensive political and judicial influence could not protect Capone from the meticulous strategy of federal law enforcement. The trial and public spectacle. Capone's trial became a national spectacle, not only because of his notoriety but also due to the public fascination with the collapse of a seemingly untouchable criminal. The proceedings exposed the extent of corruption in Chicago, but also the limitations of Capone's influence. Judges, witnesses, and jurors were carefully monitored, and the federal team ensured that no local alliances could interfere. This meticulous attention to procedure and detail resulted in a conviction for tax evasion, the first major legal victory against him in years. Prison and loss of political control. Once incarcerated, Capone's control over his criminal empire rapidly diminished. The political connections he had leveraged for years could no longer shield him from legal consequences. His absence allowed rivals to challenge his operations, while his associates struggled to maintain order without his direct leadership. The decline highlighted the temporary nature of power built on fear and corruption. Once the central figure was removed, the network's structural integrity failed. Lessons from Capone's fall. The story of Al Capone's rise and fall offers critical lessons in both criminal strategy and law enforcement tactics. It underscores the importance of targeting systemic vulnerabilities rather than just surface-level enforcement. Capone's sophisticated political and judicial network allowed him to operate for years, but it was ultimately financial scrutiny, federal coordination, and legal strategy that dismantled his empire. His downfall demonstrates that even the most entrenched criminal can be brought to justice with careful, innovative, and persistent investigation. Conclusion. The legacy of influence and its limits. Al Capone's life illustrates the complex interplay between criminal genius, political corruption, and federal law enforcement. His ability to manipulate politicians, judges, and the public allowed him to dominate Chicago's underworld, yet his over-reliance on fear, secrecy, and local influence could not withstand systematic scrutiny. The ultimate lesson is clear. While influence can extend power temporarily, accountability mechanisms, financial, legal, and institutional, eventually reassert control, proving that no empire, however sophisticated, is immune to the rule of law.